Hey everyone, Raptorspank here, and today we have Metacheck, October 27th. This is a show where I look at the meta and talk about a couple of decks I find interesting that are trending. A change I'm making is removing the gameplay of these decks just to make a more concise and short video. Let me know if you'd prefer the longer form video instead though. First though, we are going to look at the changes for patch 1.13. So they're adding a new event, which we kind of already knew about because the KDA event is coming up, and I believe that should be starting tomorrow. So I imagine it has something to do with that. We'll probably see the new KDA stuff as well, which includes a board plus the cosmetics, the new event pass like we had with Spirit Blossom. So that'll be neat. But they mentioned that they're going to be looking at Lee Sin and Make It Rain. So let's look at the Lee Sin changes here. Alright, they're upping his cost by 1, they're upping his health by 1, but not upping his damage. So clearly they're trying to make the combo slower, but make him a little bit harder to kill, but they know that buffing the power would make it easier for him to OTK. So that seems reasonable. I think these nerfs are very weak. Also, they didn't update the card art, so that's interesting. I think this is pretty weak, though. I think he needed to go back up to 6 mana, to be quite honest. And to be really honest, I'm so tired of playing against Lee Sin. I would have preferred that they just roll back most of the changes and essentially delete the character. But I do think that this is problematic because I think 5 cost and a little more health actually makes him still very, very powerful right now. 1 turn later on playing him could make the difference, but he was already losing the aggro matchups, and I don't think this is enough of a change to really make the control matchups better, but I suppose it is harder to play him while also having Deny/Bastion up, so maybe this is enough. I would have liked to see more changes, though, to be quite honest. Make It Rain. So the big rework they touted was that they're moving the cost up 1. Okay. I mean, that's definitely a big hit for it, but I mean it still does the exact same thing. So doesn't seem that bad. I'm trying to think about whether this is enough to make Bilgewater Burn not run it. I don't think so. Zap still grabs it and you can still cast it. It's going to be a little bit harder to play this at value though, and not being able to play it on turn 2 definitely makes the mirror matchup a little bit harder because Make It Rain was really good for it. And there's certain other matchups where being able to make it rain to clear the board and kill a bunch of things was kind of relevant on turn 2. So I could see this hurting that a little bit, but generally speaking, this doesn't seem like a huge nerf. And almost certainly decks like TF Swain will still want to run this because what it does is really good for their deck. And they can still cast on turn 2 because that deck usually doesn't have a 1-drop play. Some versions were running Codger, and this will hurt those decks, or those versions of the deck, but I still think it's probably, it's a pretty low nerf. I think it doesn't really hurt Burn, and I don't think it really hurts TF Swain, which are the big ones using it. And then they have some Expedition stuff. They just made it slightly less likely for you to hit the new archetypes, and they moved around some stuff. I don't play Expeditions enough to really give you a good value on this, so I'm gonna assume that these are just some minor changes that should make it more fun, and that's the only changes. So pretty lackluster. I don't like that they've gotten to balancing the game so infrequently, because it was supposed to be like, originally it was like every 2 weeks we were seeing some sort of balance changes, and now it's basically they balance it halfway to the next expansion and that's it. Which is a problem when we have a meta like we're in right now. But a lot of decks didn't get hit. The Lee Sin nerf is pretty weak. I don't think it's enough, so I think it'll slow the deck down a little bit, which might be enough to see some other decks emerge, but this is not the balance patch I wanted to see, and I think we'll probably hear that from a lot of other people too. But hopefully this is just enough to open up space in the meta for a couple of new decks, but I have a hard time seeing this being the end of Lee Sin, essentially, and he was the one that was really forcing a lot of decks out of the meta. But maybe that one mana will make all the difference for making it hard to play and protect him. So maybe decks that are looking to basically vengeance him with no other real way to pull it off. Maybe those decks will be better because now the soonest he can be played is turn 6 with Deny open. So I don't know. I think this is a troubling balance patch, but let's jump into the different decks. Alright, so I avoided talking about the big three in the last meta check, but since the balance change brings us very little in the way of changes, I think it just makes sense to talk about the big three matchups. So we're going to start with Warmother control. This couples Freljord Ramp and Payoffs with Shadow Isle's control cards. It looks to play Weirding Stones or Catalyst on turn 3 to set up for a very powerful turn 4 with either Trundle or Hearthguard. It includes Atrocity to one-turn kill with things like Trundle or Tryndamere, for example. It can be really devastating with Trundle, especially if you can land or you have a couple of ways to pump it. It can get up to like an 11 pretty quickly or things like that, and then you can fling it at your opponent to close out the game, essentially. And then on a late game, we also have Warmother's Call to set up essentially a really powerful board state that should lock our opponent out by just constantly grabbing really big units every turn. Since especially if we've gotten our turn 3 or even a second Weirding Stones out, then the only hits in the deck should be large, powerful creatures, which is the ideal. And we can get our Warmother's Call off substantially faster than our opponent should expect because we can ramp into it very, very quickly. Trundle plus Ice Pillar lets us use our large creatures as removal, essentially, since the Ice Pillar gives their biggest creature vulnerable each turn, so we can even throw away a big unit just to deal with our opponent's one major threat. Alpha Wildclaw is what I run instead of, say, Commander Ledros, because it gives us another large body that's at a fairly low cost, since we can play this as early as, say, turn 5. And it has Overwhelm, so it can force damage through to our opponent and really threaten them. Against aggro, you basically want to look to have as much life gain and board wipes as you can, and then just fight over board control. You don't really need to keep your creatures alive, per se, as long as you are just dealing with your opponent's board and keeping your life total fairly high. We can use things like Troll Chant, essentially, to lower their damage, too, while also keeping our big threat alive, so sometimes we don't have to choose. We can have both, essentially. Against Lee Sin combo, you want to look up to double removal to win through Spell Shield. Things like Troll Chant / Vile Feast plus a Vengeance. And basically you just want to wait until the last possible moment to kill your opponent's stuff. Or to set it up that even if they can establish the win, you can win by, say, Atrocity flinging something at them in response now that they've used up all their spells to basically keep their Lee Sin alive. So that's another option you can go for. And then Ruination is great for go-wide mid-range decks like Banner Scouts or, say, Bilgewater Spring, where they're going to have a lot of big threats. Ruination being able to just clear the board is very, very strong. Now let's look at Lee Sin combo. Expect him to be here to stay. I don't think the nerf to him is going to actually accomplish anything. I've heard some good points about actually he's been buffed against things like Demacia, where they were looking to set up like single combat plus concerted strike to get by, and that one extra health could actually be big. I think that's a reasonable statement. I think that matchup will be worse for them now. But I do expect to see Zed more often than Diana. I know Diana was kind of climbing up the rankings because it was a good answer to, say, burn decks. But I think the idea of using Diana to buy time for Lee Sin, because she doesn't really win on her own often, because you can't actually trigger Nightfall enough in the deck to really make a huge threat out of her. Because, yes, you can get her to, like, 7-3 sometimes, but you have to really hit the Pale Cascade, like, Nut Draw to make her a huge threat on her own in this shell. So, she really is just a time buyer, and with Lee Sin coming down a turn later, I think it's going to be a little bit harder to buy that time, whereas Zed is a legitimate threat on his own that basically it comes down fast and it threatens your opponent very, very quickly. So I think that's going to probably be the better strategy to go with. But he isn't as good into burn, so there's a real catch-20 with this of maybe you want to deal with burn, or maybe you want to just have more ways for your deck to win. The deck looks to build a supersized Zed or Lee Sin with Overwhelm off a Zenith Blade. Essentially, that's your primary win condition, and then you either kill extremely quickly with Zed starting his attacks potentially as early as turn 3, turn 4, or late game Lee Sin that has Overwhelm off of Zenith Blade, so with Dragon Rage it hits twice and just kills your opponent out of nowhere. It's pretty easy to establish a one-turn kill that kills your opponent even from 20 health with him, using the Zenith Blade. And then it protects its combo with a bunch of counterspells. In our case, we're running Nopavai and Deny. There is some argument for trying to get Bastion into the list, but I personally prefer this as it catches the most scenarios, I think. But you can always drop a Deny for a Bastion if you want to have the full suite of options or something like that. And then it also uses Spacey Sketcher and Eye of the Dragon to slow down aggro. Those are your primary cards you want to look for in the aggro matchup, since Eye of the Dragon especially can keep gaining you life every turn off of the Dragonlings, and it's pretty easy for you to get Dragonlings most turns. And then Spacey Sketcher giving you that turn 1 play can be pretty huge, especially if you can Spacey Sketcher plus get the Challenger Snake. That's very brutal for burn, since that basically kills 2 things for the price of 1. So that's a really good card for the aggro matchup. And then Zed can be a good win condition against them because it's kind of hard for them to remove. They need Noxian Fervor, for example, which you can Nopify. So against that deck, having Zed can be a pretty good win, since it pressures them very, very early, and then they have to start losing their own units just to stay alive to Zed or to keep you from leveling up Zed. So he's really good in that matchup. Against Control, you basically want to look to play threats with some sort of counterspell backup. In Control, most threats that you're worrying about, or most answers you're worrying about, are things like Vengeance, so Deny is going to be a lot better than Nopify, but even Nopify can be good if you're running Bastion, because in that case you can always use Bastion. Bastion does improve the Control matchup, and you can Nopify whatever they use to strip the spell shield for Vengeance. But in our case, you really want Deny. That's the best thing. So you'd want to land a threat with Deny up. If you're going the Zed route and you're playing him on turn 3, then you could always run the Zed Nopify plan, because they can grasp him to get around it. But if they're looking for other kinds of removal, Nopify can answer most things that would happen that early in the game. Now let's look at Bilgewater Burn. I expect Bilgewater Burn to still be good. It's still one of the best aggro decks in the game because of just how fast it pressures your opponent, and also has these great late game cards like Gangplank, Decimate, even Jack can be pretty strong in the late game. It might be worth swapping Make It Rain for a 2-drop like House Spider, Hired Gun, or Crimson Disciple. Crimson Disciple plays well, both that and Hired Gun actually play well into Control, where they're going to have a bunch of 1 to 2 damage board wipes. These all survive that, and Crimson Disciple, in fact, punishes them for using something like Avalanche. House Spider gives you a lot of power on board, and the House Spider gets around Withering Wail itself, so that can be pretty strong. The burn aspect of Make It Rain might still be stronger than that, but I could see some argument for dropping it now that you can't play it on turn 2 for just a little more turn 2 power. But generally speaking, the idea is to overwhelm your opponents with hyper-aggression. You want to keep heavy 1-drop hands in most matchups, because being able to play 1-drop turn 1 and then like 2 1-drops on turn 2 can be very, very threatening against most decks in the format right now. That's really, really strong. Lounging Lizard should force a fair amount of damage through in most matchups. My go-to 3-drop now. I really liked Monkey Idol, but it's kind of slow for where the meta has been lately, so Lounging Lizard gets overly sin because Elusive is a very strong keyword, and it survives a lot of the removal that Warmother can put out on turn 3, so it's just a really, really good drop for what the deck's trying to do these days. You want to keep Noxian Fervor against grasp-heavy decks or decks with lifesteal units, since you can always block the lifestealer and then Noxian Fervor your opponent to keep the lifestealer from actually. Jack is great against slow decks like Warmother Control. You can also keep a Decimate in a matchup like that, because it's very possible that that could be quick enough to deal to your opponent. Gangplank is great against Lee Sin, potentially, because his board wipe aspect is very, very good, and usually the only way they can kill the Gangplank is by blocking with something like Lee Sin, and that usually ends up with Lee Sin dying as well, so that's a great card. But generally speaking, you're just looking to be as fast as possible while trying to stay ahead of your opponent's board. So those are the big decks I'm looking at going into this this next couple of weeks. Not too surprising. The patch really sucks. It really does. I'm just going to call it what it is. Riot had been doing really, really well at balancing up until this point, but they clearly don't understand where the game is at right now, so I think it's just fair to call them out on it. They really need to see this. The fact that we're still dealing with another probably 2 weeks at this point, maybe they rush a hotfix out to correct their mistakes, but chances are we're probably dealing with this for another 2 weeks, so these 3 decks are the big decks. Depending on what you want to do, the Lee Sin combo deck is some of the better win rates, I think, because the burn matchup is bad for it, but there is a number of ways with, like, Eye of the Dragon that you can hold on in those matchups, and then against control it should be pretty resilient. But the nerf to the mana cost is going to hurt it in the control matchup slightly, so that's one hesitation to have for that deck. Burn is going to be one of the best decks if you're looking for really, really fast matchups and you're just looking to try and have the volume approach. It might have the lowest win rate of the 3 decks. I think that's a reasonable belief to have. But since its matches are so fast, if you are going for just a volume approach, this should be one of the better decks to do. Or one of the other aggro decks like Discard Aggro or a Nightfall Aggro. I think Discard Aggro is actually going to be even worse after the patch. I've heard some whispers of the KDA cards that are coming being really good for Warmother, potentially. So I think you could expect to see more Warmother in the coming weeks than even before now. So that is a huge nerf to Discard Aggro, since Withering Wail plus Avalanche is really, really good against that deck, and that's Warmother staples. So I could see that being true. Warmother, obviously, I think is still going to be in a great spot. I think it can win the Lee Sin matchup, even if it is a little unfavored. And I think since Lee Sin is going to be slowed down, I think it's going to be even better against that matchup. Like, I think your win rate's going to go up a little bit, at least, even if I think Lee Sin is still favored. So I think Warmother's going to be in a great spot. And like I said, there might be some cards getting printed that could be good into Warmother, though it's hard to say whether it will actually be good enough or not, but good enough to actually make inclusion in the deck. But it could be a pretty good spot for Warmother to be going forward. And to be honest, that's what I was playing most recently, because it has been doing very well and aggro has been so prevalent. Warmother's really great into that. So if you're tired of playing against aggro, Warmother is a great deck for that matchup. So those are the best decks I'd keep an eye on. It's quite possible that with so little changes, I might do Warmother later in this week for On the Grind, but no promises on that. Often depends on how I'm feeling by the end of the week. So thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe for more videos just like it.